Howdy ho, neighborinos. Today is October the 23rd, 2022, and I say this often, but it's hard to believe that we're here already. Time flies when you're having fun. I was reading some news stories this week regarding the Canadian real estate market, as one does, and I read an interesting piece of information which made me think of some economic principles I learned when I was a young man. And I like to think that these things are simple and obvious enough that they are, well, I don't want to say common sense, but commonly known and understood principles. But you know what they say about common sense, it's not so common, and so perhaps neither are these principles. Well, did I hear a thing? Oh, I did hear a thing. Yeah, so the prices we've seen I guess go into retreat the last few months, right? So we're seeing prices a lot of price growth that we saw last year kind of being retraced. And there's a lot of losses on housing valuations. And that comes at a very interesting time in the market cycle because, well, I shouldn't say an interesting time. It comes at a predictable time, right? The principle of supply and demand is at action, and the emergent behaviors that come out of that are also on display for us in the Canadian market at the moment. And so what do I mean by that? Well, last year and the year before, with COVID, but especially last year, and just so we're clear, I mean, this is a function of a government policy, specifically the printing of money. The increasing of the money supply led to inflationary pressure on asset prices. So we saw the climb of real estate valuations, right? That's what happened in kind of dry technical terms. But what we saw was a ramping up of pricing over the last year or two, which obviously looked very good on paper, right? And that ramping up on pricing sends a signal, right? That's what a price is. A price is a signal. It says make more of this. Or make less of this, right? Or you're making exactly the right amount of this. That's what a price is, right? And of course, as prices increased on housing, that sent a signal to builders, hey, make more of this, right? There is profit to be made. That house that you didn't think you'd be able to profit on at $850,000 is now selling for $1.2 million, so you can do it profitably, right? That's essentially the message that is sent when prices go up, right? And builders responded to the price increases, as they always do. And so they started building houses. Housing starts started to increase. And so right now, we have I want to say a record number. I don't believe it is actually a record though, but we have a glut of new housing starts and builds that have come online in the last 6 to 9 months, this last year, and now prices are in retreat. So what does that mean, right? Well, if you're one of these builders, if you're building a new home, right, that you thought was not profitable and was not worth your time to build at $850,000, but then prices went up, so now you think you can sell for 1.2, so you start building them, but now prices are in retreat and it's back down to, let's say, $1 million, which is approximating how prices have moved around. Depending on your budget and your margins, that project may no longer be profitable, right? Developers typically are not aiming for 30% margins like a retailer is, right? They're working a much tighter margins, 10, 12, maybe 15%. So, if your prices fall from 1.2 mil to $1 million, the margin is really not there to ensure that these builders are profitable. And of course, if the margin is not there and the builders are not profitable, right, then they will need to sell their properties. They have a problem. They have payroll, right? They have inventory, right? These things need to be paid for. So they cannot sit on these new assets that they've created and wait until the valuation rises again. They must sell them today so they can make payroll tomorrow. So if all of these houses come onto the market at the same time, you end up with a glut of houses and prices fall. Actually, because supply increases so dramatically, it puts further downward pressure on prices. Right? There is a okay, I'm going to come back to this in a second, but there is a very, very, very famous video. Most people have seen it. It is of the Washington bridge collapsing. And there's actually another famous video of the London, I want to call it the London Millennium Bridge. I'm not sure. It's that weird white modern looking one that they built maybe 20 years ago. Anyways, there's another famous video of that bridge, and on its opening week, I believe, for that bridge, people came to see this new bridge and to walk across it. I don't understand going to a bridge opening, but anyways, people did, thousands and thousands of them, and they all wanted to cross the bridge or whatever. It's a pedestrian bridge, right? It's a walking bridge. It's not a car and bus bridge. So anyways, tens of thousands of people got on this bridge, and they started walking, and large groups of people. So there's a concept, and forgive me because this is completely outside of my sort of body of knowledge, really, but I believe the phenomenon is referred to as synchronicity. I might be wrong about that. It might have a different, better name. But basically, when you get large groups of people, or really large populations of anything, really, sometimes those things can produce emergent behaviors that are counter to your intuitions about how those groups might behave. So, for example, one would expect, right, if you get two people or four strangers walking down a path, they will walk down that path at different gaits, different paces, different speeds, right? Some people will shuffle, some people long strides, etc., etc. And so there's a diversity of how people walk, right? You get the four groups of people together. Now, what happened on this fateful day in London when they opened this bridge was, 10,000 people or so were on the bridge. And the strangest thing happened. It turns out that when you get together 10,000 or so people, right, and the number is not particularly important, just a large number of people, a large group of people, it turns out that you get the synchronicity, this emergent behavior, wherein all of the people on that bridge began to walk more or less in sync with one another. So left foot, right foot, same time. This is a problem for bridges, right? For bridges, really any structure, they have what is referred to as a resonant frequency, right? That is a frequency, a vibration that resonates with the structure of that building, that kind of moves with the structure to amplify the motion. And sure enough, on this day that the bridge opened, these 10,000 or so people crossing the bridge all synced up and began walking left and right in sync with each other. And the bridge began to sway because of the resonant forces. The structure of the bridge couldn't hold rigidly against those forces. Now, thankfully, luckily, in the case of the London Bridge, there was no collapse. The bridge just moves violently, and it's very interesting to watch. Nothing happened to anybody, and they made some changes to the bridge to try to ensure that this wouldn't happen again. In the case of the Washington Bridge, that bridge collapsed spectacularly and killed a bunch of people. And of course, it was a slightly different situation because it wasn't tens of thousands of people all syncing up. It was a different type of synchronicity that involved the wind and resonant frequencies in the bridge. And the wind caused the pattern that ultimately caused the bridge to fail. But in both cases, we got this emergent behavior that was not expected. This resonant frequency that sort of, for an engineer is an important consideration. Certainly that is something they learned from building those bridges. But in general, it's not something that we as individuals, even smart individuals like engineers, necessarily take into account very often. These emergent behaviors or emergent happenings, right? Emergent, right? That is to emerge from somewhere else, right? They come out of something else. Are not always very easy to account for or understand. And oftentimes, even when it is actually clear and easy to account for them, either through stupidity or convenience, people will often misinterpret these things. Right. And so we'll give you a perfect example in the economy. Right. If you've ever played musical chairs, I think that's an experience everybody's had. The music's playing, everybody's dancing around the chairs, whatever. I haven't played this game in 20 years, but for the first 10, 15 seconds the song is playing, everybody's kind of dancing. They don't really care. But then, 15, 20 seconds have gone by and people start to think to themselves, okay, well, the DJ, MC, whatever, is going to cut the music soon. So I better get eyeballs on the chair, right? I better get close to one. I better be ready, right? And so what begins to happen, if you're watching the game from the sidelines, right, is maybe the first round goes by and some people are caught off guard. Maybe the second round goes by and some people are caught off guard. By the third round, everybody's waiting and listening after 10, 15 seconds for the music to cut out. And so you get this kind of stampeding behavior, right, where every so often everybody is primed. They know, okay, now's the time to start looking for a chair. And then sure enough, the music goes out and then they sit down and blah, 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 right? And we have a very similar thing in the economy. As I said at the beginning of today's seminar, or towards the beginning, in the economy, you are going to get emergent behaviors that are directed by the signaling of prices, because prices signal make more or make less of something, right? And this causes a type of stampeding behavior, or perhaps more accurate of a metaphor rather than a stampede would be spooling. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of spooling, but if you have a car with a turbo, or a super or a turbo, but usually we refer to a turbo. A turbo must be spooled, right? So a turbo, really simply, takes air and blows it into your engine so that your engine has more air so that it can combust more efficiently and more powerfully, right? That's what a turbo does. It gives your engine more air so it can blow stuff up more. And that gives you, in turn, more horsepower, more speed, more torque, all of these things. And the way that it works, of course, is a turbo is basically a giant blower fan, right, that spins very quickly and sucks in lots of air and blows it into your engine. And of course, it's the rotation of it is powered by the engine. So we have what is called turbo spooling or super spooling, or sometimes it's called wind up, or there's a bunch of layman terms for it. But essentially, if you get into a car that's turbocharged, right, and you put your pedal to the metal, as they say, the car will move immediately, of course, because you put your foot on the pedal, but it does not move with 100% of its speed, power, horsepower, whatever you want to call it, right? It instead will move off the line and be a little sluggish, right? It'll come off the line a little bit slowly, and then the turbo will spool up, right? Which you will hear. I mean, all of this is happening in a couple of seconds in a good car, but even less than a couple of seconds, maybe less than a second in a really good car. But the turbo will spool up, which of course you will hear, right? You'll hear the turbo kick in, and it'll start spinning. It's now spinning based on the rotational energy of the motor. And now that the turbo is up to speed, now that it's spooled up, it will deliver the air to the engine, which will then allow the engine to go even faster. And of course, this can result in, you know, funny mechanical quirks wherein you might need all of your power for the next second, but you have a turbo that takes a second and a quarter to spool up, which means that actually within the second that you need the maximum power of your vehicle, you can't have it, which is an important thing. It's an issue that most people never run into, but if you're somebody like a race car driver, that is something you have to actually account for. And the engineers and mechanics who help to build and maintain and support your car, that will be a concern for them, right? How long does it take for the turbo to spool up? How quickly does it deliver its power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So turbo spool, or spooling up. And there's lots of things in life that behave kind of similarly. And the economy is very much no different, right? If we take any given business really, these organizations, they have inertia. They're like they're like cargo ships, right? You don't just open up a multi-billion-dollar company tomorrow, right? That's something that needs to be built. It must be put on a path, set on a course, and navigate through the challenges of the world and of life and of the economy, right? And so if you have a super tanker, like Google or Amazon, of course, these are companies who actually, for the most part, benefited from the pandemic and the things that happened there. So they'll probably be fine. But if you have a company like that, right, Google and Amazon are both 25 years old or so, something like that at this point, right? Like these are massive entities that are very, very important, but also they're not new, right? These things take time. And even if we look at some of the more overnight successes, right? Facebook's been around for how long? Tesla been around for how long now, right? These things, they don't emerge out of nowhere, right? And the same is true for smaller businesses. If I go back to my Toronto area developer who does, I don't know, let's say $50 million a year in development, which, nowadays is not that much. That'd be like building 50 houses, but that was reasonable back then. So let's call them more like a $200 million developer. Okay, so they're doing a few hundred houses a year. They have to buy lumber for a few hundred houses, and they probably try to buy it in bulk to save money, right? So they want to do 1 or 2 lumber orders in a year rather than 6 or 12, right? They got to buy insulation bulk. They got to buy piping bulk. They got to buy shingles bulk. They got to buy all of these things, right? So they're going to outlay literally tens of millions of dollars, right? If they're aiming to make $200 million in sales, they're going to outlay tens of millions of dollars up front to buy these materials, buy the land, develop, et cetera, all of the business functions they must do, right? So that they can eventually have a product when everything's said and done, that home to sell to you. And that process might take 3, 6, 9, 12, 18, 24, 36 months, right? Depending on what you're building. A condo building might take 48 months, right? So these projects are large and they take a lot of time. They don't just happen immediately. And so much like in my car where my turbo is spooling up, right? In my economy, my businesses spool up. If you send out a price signal that says, hey, buildings cost this much, do your calculations accordingly, people will do the calculations and they will figure out what is the profit margin that is competitive, and they will aim at that, and they will buy materials based on that. They will hire labor based on that, and they will buy land and plot to develop it based on that information. Much like the turbo, you have a problem if you require the power the turbo delivers, or the housing that the developer is going to deliver, you have a problem if you need it immediately, because it is not instant. It is not digital, right? When you push on that gas pedal, or when you say, "Hey, we need more housing," well, power is half a second to a second away, or housing is 6 to 18 months away, right? And that is that's how the economy works. And so what we end up with is you end up with people overcorrecting, right? Imagine, if you will, trying to drive. Maybe you've had this experience. If you've played some video games, maybe you've run into this problem. Imagine trying to drive a car where whenever you make an input, so you push the gas, you push the brake, you turn the steering wheel, any of those things, there's a 2-second delay before the car does what you say, right? Would you be able to drive the vehicle? And the reason I said maybe in video games you had this, right? If you play like a racing game online or something, you get that lag stuff sometimes. Sometimes that's what the experience is like, right? Your input is delayed, and then it makes it hard to drive the vehicle. And of course, what happens? So first of all, it's not impossible to drive the vehicle with a 2-second delay. It's just hard. It's just really, really hard, right? What tends to happen is, as people, and almost everybody runs into this problem because we're all human, we tend to overcorrect, right? So if you're driving your car normally, right, there's little variations. The road's not perfectly straight. There's bumps, there's this, there's that. And so you're always kind of moving your hands a little bit, always trying to find the sweet spot, stay in your lane, and make it to your destination, hopefully safely and in one piece, right? You add that delay, and what happens is that same regular behavior that you don't even think about, you're actually making hundreds of corrections all the time to stay your course, because you actually have not judged things as well as you think you have. In your head, you're like, oh, I get from A to B and I know all the steps. But in reality, you're every maybe 10, 20 times a second, you're adjusting what you're doing to make sure that you stay on track, right? So we tend to overcorrect. And so if you were to put that delay on someone's vehicle, they'd end up swinging around wildly because they're trying to make these minor corrections for these things that they didn't anticipate. And of course, there's a 2-second delay. And so by the time they made the correction, it is the thing that they were concerned about, they're no longer concerned about. And now the correction has given them a new concern, right? And so we see the same exact thing in our economy, right? Well, first of all, the economy is nothing like a car. You cannot drive it, right? Secondly, if there was a good analogy for the economy, it'd probably be something like a natural gas super tanker, where like you have a ship that's the size of a small town carrying enough natural gas that if it were to explode, it'd be the equivalent of like 5 nuclear bombs going off. And a ship like that is a pretty good metaphor for the economy, not because of the explosiveness or anything like that, but just because a ship like that does not do anything on a dime, right? All of its moves are very carefully considered and pre-planned, because you can't make a 6-inch correction when you're driving a super tanker that's 4 soccer fields long. You can't do that, right? So that's a good analogy, but it's still, even that, even the super tanker analogy implies that we have more control over the economy than we really, really do, right? But what ends up happening, of course, is now this system, right, that we call the economy, that's supposed to tell us where and how to allocate resources. This system, it does its job, really. It's we who fail to interpret what it's telling us, because we don't leave enough margin for error, right? We don't leave enough margin for error. To go back to my car analogy one last time, right? If you're in a car and I say to you, hey, we're gonna cause this 2-second delay. what can you do to make sure that your drive remains safe even with the 2-second delay? Right? And the answer is, well, you can give yourself a 2-second margin of error, right? You can drive slowly enough that in 2 seconds, if you've made a mistake, you will not hit anything so that you have time to correct your mistake, right? So obviously, if you're traveling at 150 kilometers an hour, right, in 2 seconds, you're going to be, 50 meters down the road, and your potential ability to correct an error is virtually non-existent in 2 seconds, right? But if you're traveling at 10 or 15 kilometers an hour and you're only going to go a meter or two in those 2 seconds, then your ability to correct for errors is much, much greater, right? Now, in the economy, most businesses, that's exactly what businesses try to do, right? Don't bite off more than you can chew, take it slow, and kind of work the business that's available to you, right? Unfortunately, in the economy, a lot of us don't leave that margin for error. And that exists in a number of ways, right? Individuals who aren't saving for a rainy day because you may lose your job, or the economy could turn on you, et cetera, et cetera. Businesses which do the same, they don't have savings, they're not prepared for lean times. And then you have the opposite end where it's not a savings issue, but overextending, right? Overinvesting. To go back to my developer example, you're a $200 million a year developer, and you decide this year that you're going to become a $400 million a year developer. And so you buy lumber and shingles accordingly, right? Well, now you've overextended yourself. It's fine if everything goes to plan, then you become a $400 million developer. But if something goes wrong, if your plan is disrupted, then maybe that business folds, right? Maybe it fails, right? So these are the challenges of the economy. And between these two things, most people are not leaving enough margin for error. And so that results in these emergent behaviors, or the synchronicity, where you get thousands or tens of thousands or millions of people who are all in the economy. They're all responding to similar signals, and you would expect a diverse response. But what you end up with, as in the case of the bridges that I began talking about, right? What you end up with is synchronicity, where lots and lots of people are making the same error, mistake, miscalculation, whatever you want to call it. And so resources in the economy are being misallocated, right? They're being put somewhere where they're about to be wasted. And tens of thousands of millions of people are all doing this at the same time. And this is how we end up with a quote unquote recession, economic downturn, whatever you want to call it, right? To put it a different way, because misallocation, it sounds so innocent, right? So let's just dig into what that is for a second, right? Misallocation of resources. What do we mean? If you go to the store and you buy some bananas because you are going to make some banana bread or banana cake or banana, whatever, you're gonna make something out of bananas, right? So you go buy a dozen bananas, and your bananas, they're kind of green. You need ripe bananas, so you put the bananas on the counter to ripen up for a day or two, so you make your banana bread. And 2-3 days go by, your bananas, they become brown and spotty, and they're ripe, they're ready to go, they're ready for you to bake with. But something comes up, whatever, you get a call, go out with friends or something, and so your bananas were ripe, but you let 2-3 days go by because whatever, things come up in life, right? This is what we refer to. This is literally an economic misallocation of resources, right? Well, those bananas are going bad, and 3 days after they were perfect for baking, they're garbage. Now, those resources were misallocated. That's all that happened, right? You thought you wanted to use bananas on Tuesday. Turns out you didn't want to use them until Sunday. And you did not have a means to preserve those bananas. So the fact that you bought bananas in preparation for a Tuesday that you wouldn't use until Sunday meant those bananas went to waste. Now, obviously, a dozen bananas cost whatever, $2-3. It's not a big deal for most people. They can afford, to make that mistake once or twice, and that is fair. But this is what it means to misallocate resources. It means to put them to waste, or in many cases, that waste is actually destructive, right? Those resources are lost to their purpose. And this is true of lots of things. If I go back to my example of the developer, let's say he buys timber. Let's say he buys timber by the ton, and he buys, 100 tons of timber to build 200 homes. Let's just say. He's got to store that timber somewhere, right? He's got to have like a timber yard or a lumber yard, something like that, right? And, depending on how big he is, maybe he can't afford to have like an actual like $1 million timber facility, because frankly, who can, right? Very, very few businesses can afford that, right? That's just the expense. So he's probably storing them, in the yard with his heavy equipment and everything else for his construction company. Well, in the yard, what's he got covering that timber? Oh, he's got tarps. Okay, well, tarps, they'll keep the timber dry-ish for a little bit, but they're going to let moisture in eventually if the timber sits out there. How long can the timber sit for? Can the timber sit in his yard for a year? What about 2 years? What about 3 years? Does wood warp, right? Do things happen to timber over time? And of course, the answer is yes. Wood does warp. It can't stay outside indefinitely. You can't buy wood in 2010 and use it in 2020, right? If you buy wood in 2010, most likely you need to use that wood in 2010, maybe 2011, and for some applications 2012, but for the most part, right? And of course it varies from material to material, but even things like steel, right? Like structural steel beams, let's say. Structural steel beams are coated in an epoxy, like an epoxy resin anti-rust coating. That's how most structural steel is protected from rust and corrosion. This is epoxy resin coating. And that coating has a shelf life. It wears off. It's UV resistant because UV and water are the two primary means of deteriorating steel, right? And actually the UV doesn't bother the steel, but it bothers the resin that's protecting the steel. So it's got to be a UV resistant coating. And the resin is there to keep the water out, right? Well, that stuff has a shelf life. Every 20, 25 years, you have to recoat the steel in this protective coating, or it will be eroded and it will rust away. And we've all seen rusty old buildings and bridges and stuff, right? And eventually that rust will become severe enough that structure will fail, or we will need to demolish it, right? Or refurbish it, either or, right? So even things that we think of as incredibly durable and strong, like steel, they have a shelf life. They don't last forever. And so when you misallocate resources and you waste them, right? It's the same as storing things in the trash. And you can understand how, if one business wastes, I don't know, let's say $10 million worth of lumber, a big whoop. I mean, it sucks, and $10 million is a lot of money, but it's a pittance in the economy. And that's true, right? People wonder, and they don't really understand how recession works, how one day things can be really good and the next day things can be really bad. And the reality is that when we say that you're misallocating resources, that you're misplacing resources, what we mean is they're being destroyed, right? That the thing that was available is no longer available because of mismanagement for one reason or another. Right? And there's not necessarily any particular person to point fingers at. And the problem with our economy, or the reason why we have things like recessions, is this synchronicity, right? This emergence property that seems to exist in the world. That sometimes a lot of people are all doing the same thing. They're all rushing to sit in the chairs, right, at their game of musical chairs. Or they're all stampeding for the exit in a crowded theater when someone yells fire, right? And when you get these types of emergent behaviors, they can create very, very bad / dangerous situations for the people who are involved in them. So, I'm an investor. What does this mean for me? Well, we're watching prices in retreat. And we're also getting reports of record or near record housing starts and homes under construction at this time in Canada. The two things do not go well together, right? So in the real estate business cycle, we have what do you call it? I guess you have a cycle. It's got 4 stages, right? You start with undersupply. I mean, technically you start at any 4 of the cycles, but you have undersupply, right? Where the market is underserved. There are not enough domiciles for the people who desire them. At this time, it is a seller's market. So there are more buyers than there are sellers, and there are more buyers than there are products. Then the market moves to balanced. Buyers and sellers even out, and the market is balanced. It then transitions from undersupplied to oversupplied, right? Because, like I said, it spools up, right? So if we have a situation where there aren't enough homes and there's more buyers than there are homes, supply and demand pushes the price up. The price goes up, and that indicates to our manufacturers, our builders, hey, build more of this because you can make more money. So they do. But like I said, it takes 6, 9, 12, 18, 24, 36 months. So now they start building at a time when the signals indicate that, yes, they should do this. But now a year or two goes by, and we move now from undersupplied to balanced, right? Either buyers have dropped out of the market, or more and more properties have come onto the market until they've satisfied the sellers. But then the properties keep coming on the market. So now we move into oversupply, right? Oversupply. Now it's a buyer's market, right? There are more properties than there are people who want to buy them. Supply and demand tells us that prices will fall as a result. Prices come down, right? And it's a buyer's market. And then that eventually moves. That falling prices indicate to developers, stop building, don't build more. So they stop again, right? 6, 12, 24, 36 months. So they may stop today, but it won't have an effect on supply until 2 years from now, for example. So 2 years go by, of course, and now buyers and sellers have balanced each other out again. We're now in an equilibrium again. And so now we move back towards a seller's market, right, where there's an undersupply and things else. So that's the market cycle. That's what it does. In real estate, an investor is always aiming, right, to be there when there's oversupply. That's when you want to be buying. That's the best time in the market cycle, because during oversupply, prices are falling, right? That's when you're going to get the lowest price. There's an oversupply of properties, which means the prices are falling, and you can get in and get a good deal of a price before we move back into undersupply, where prices are high, and you can then sell and make a good return on your investment, right? We are in that market cycle right now, and it's it can be difficult to see exactly where, right? Like, I wish I could give like a specific mathematical formula. This is exactly where we are. It's very difficult to do that because of the way in which we, and by we I mean the government, manipulates the markets. So it can be very difficult to see. And what I mean by that is that because of the way they manipulate the markets, there are fluctuations in supply and demand, as there always are, but it's not obvious that those are organic, that's a natural fluctuation, right? That prices are rising because people genuinely desire more homes, or because the government is doing something else, something unrelated that's causing prices to increase, right? For the last 2 years, prices have increased not because people want to live in homes more, not because people have decided that they value the house more than they did 2-3 years ago, although there was a little bit of that too. But primarily, prices rose because the government was being very, very, very irresponsible. And they wanted to basically spend money that wasn't theirs. And of course, in order to do that, you have to steal it from people. And the way that they did that was by taxing them through inflation, by printing the money. And unfortunately, they're doing already what politicians throughout history have done. Basically, every time a society goes off of real money, right? Our society does not have real money. We have monopoly money. That is, you would never take Canadian dollars for the value of the Canadian dollars. Whereas, Roman denarii, which were made of gold, uh, they were worth their weight in gold until they weren't, because the Romans did the same thing we do. But at first they were, right? And our dollars, which were based on the British pound sterling, and the British pound sterling was, of course, based on the value of sterling silver, right? So and gold, and of course, same with the American dollar, right? It used to be backed by gold. So these are things where we've transitioned to fake money, fiat currency, and all throughout history, pretty much every single society, when they move to fake money, the politicians get greedy and they start printing fake money so that they can do whatever they want with them. I mean, they're thieves, right? So they're going to do what they want to do. They're going to steal. And it never works. It always collapses. And usually when it does, what the politicians do, tell me if this sounds familiar to you. Usually what happens is when the politicians get caught with their hands in the cookie jar, they can't admit that they're stealing because people will kill them. I mean, literally, they would kill them. If and it's something that frustrates me every day. If people really understood what Justin Trudeau and his crew of people were doing, like, they would kill them. They would literally murder them in their beds. But people don't understand, so that won't happen. And violence isn't good, so I guess that's for the best. I don't know. When you're as crooked as these people are, I'm not so sure that violence is the worst option, but I'm certainly not advocating for anybody to hurt anyone. I'm not interested in that, even though it might be kind of enjoyable in a schadenfreude sense. But what politicians have done historically is, after they get caught with their hand in the cookie jar, they say, oh, no. That's not us. That's those guys over there. Enemy X, Y, or Z, right? If you're British, maybe it was the French. If you were German, maybe it was the French. If you were Russian, maybe it was the Germans, right? Whatever you were. If you're American, it was the British. Or if you're Canadian, it was the Americans. Or if you're Mexican, it was the Americans. Or, so whoever. If you're Japanese, it was the Koreans or the Chinese. And if you're Chinese, it was the Koreans or the Japanese, etc., right? You go blame your enemies, right? The Nigerians were blaming the Egyptians, etc., right? So that's historically what we have done. You tell me if it reminds you of anything that's happening in the world right now. And of course, most of the time, previously when we did this, it resulted in war with those same nations. It's my hope that we're smarter and wiser now. Yeah. I like to think I'm a pretty well-read person. Got my Kindle here. And, I read books, and obviously I read books and articles and try to collect information and understand the world and make good decisions, I don't read as much as I think I should. I'd like to read more. It's hard. There's not a lot of time, and there's so many distractions in life. And, it scares me a little bit when I think about how much better I myself could be at reading and staying on top of things. And, whenever I look around me, it feels like, I might be wrong, I'm not with people seeing what they do with their time, but it seems when I talk to most people, like, they're doing less reading than I'm doing, right? And when I say reading, I'm not talking about Harry Potter, right? So that's a type of reading, but that's different. That's entertainment. I mean, like, reading for knowledge and growth and that sort of thing. I don't know what you do, because it's so hard. There's so many distractions, right? This computer I'm on is a distraction. The phone in my pocket is a distraction. The people around. Life is full of distractions. It's not to make excuses. It's just to say it's hard sometimes to get around to and to prioritize reading for growth, for knowledge, for learning. And I think if people don't do that, they will not have the knowledge. They will not understand or know really fundamentally what I'm talking about here. And it's really scary, because I was just saying, hopefully we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, but I seriously question how many people actually know and understand what those mistakes were. I first of all, there's an element of hubris here, because I'm assuming that I do, and it's not clear. I think I hope, certainly economically, I have a better understanding than most people do of some of these historical things. But even then, I mean, I'm assuming that I have knowledge and access to knowledge that I maybe don't. One thing that's certainly very, very fascinating is, when I was in school, um, and I'm not a huge advocate of higher education, but when I was in university and I was studying economics, and even when I was in high school and I was learning about economics, you learn about these things, and they're very abstract, right? It's textbook. Supply goes up, demand goes down, what happens, etc., that sort of thing. And some of the books made more of an effort to, and professors and teachers, etc., made more of an effort to kind of contextualize these things and make them real, and bring your understanding, your life kind of into perspective through the knowledge, right? And certainly the talk of these phenomena, stagflation, recession, depression, and sort of some of the things that happen to countries and societies when they go through these things. I read through these books and I thought I understood. And from like a math and theory perspective, I did understand, right? I got there's some of the harder economic math that I would struggle to do today, but for the most part, I got those things, right? And certainly, whatever can be said about my understanding of the mathematics, my understanding of the theory was always very good. That's what I was always strong at. Having gotten that education and then not experienced something like a Great Depression or recession, or this type of fiscal irresponsibility of printing money, and then to go through it as we are now, the reality of how people react to these things and how the world moves in response to these forces, it's very difficult, perhaps impossible, to capture in a textbook. I mean, really, if you put in a textbook the things that we as a society are doing today and said, hey, this is I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but these are the outcomes of printing money like a maniac, like, people would read the textbook and they would laugh and they just say, well, these things seem unrelated. And yet historically there does seem to be a correlation between kind of people going a little bit nutty when you start printing the money. And so here we are. Anyways, I'm sorry, because these were kind of long-winded thoughts, and they were primarily focused on economics rather than investing. I was looking at the market, and especially this morning and this weekend, I was looking at properties to prepare for today's seminar, and I was just struck by how much of the price growth we've seen kind of be reabsorbed or lost, right, as prices are falling. And so I wanted to dig a little deeper into why the real estate cycle is the way that it is. What is the underlying mechanism or mechanisms? Why the market and the economy moves the way that it does. And so I've given you, the Coles Notes version, the simplified version, but hopefully I've given you a very clear picture as to how a bunch of individual actors can come together to be orchestrated by a couple of signals, right? In this case, price, and how that, in combination with delay, lag, timeliness, whatever you want to call it, can result in emergent behaviors that can be both unpredictable, detrimental, and widespread or synchronous throughout your society. And and how that can result in sort of these sharp corrections and these periods of economic instability. So I hope that I've painted that picture for you. I hope you have a slightly better understanding of how and why it is that the economy ebbs and flows the way that it does. Changes in the economy move through it like waves. They ripple. It is not like I don't even know what to compare it to. Like those marquee signs where all the pixels flip at the same time, so you go from one image to another. You have them at like stadiums and stuff like that. The economy is not like that. We don't all flip at the same time, right? When you make a change to the economy, it ripples from one side to the other. And that ripple can have massive and detrimental effects, right? If you do something that ripples, the side that gets the ripple first could be benefited or could be punished by their proximity to the beginning of that ripple, right? And so those are things that aren't thought about, not considered. People don't care, and I don't know that I blame them, but it can definitely spell trouble for an economy moving forward. And it's something to definitely worry about. As investors, like I said, you want to target that period in time where you're going to get the best bang for your buck, right? You're going to get the lowest price for the most value. And so I think that we are moving out of an undersupplied period and we are approaching perhaps an oversupplied period. And that's a very good time to be an investor, to be buying. And so everybody should be, working on their savings, working on their capital, and working on their access to credit so that if and when we kind of reach the bottom and prices look like they're ready to rebound, you can buy and participate in the market. Thank you for your time. That's all I have prepared for today. I guess before I go, if anyone has any questions, I'll take them now. Otherwise, thank you as always for joining me, either this morning or if you're with me later on in the week or the year on YouTube, then thank you for being here. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Until next week, that's everything.